Hello. I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Shang Jingye for inviting me to Taiwan and to speak at this conference. I'm very, very sorry I cannot deliver this talk in person. Let me share my screen. My name is Beatrice Behlen. Born in Germany, I came to London in 1989 to study and then to work in different arts and culture organizations. Since 2007, I've been the Senior Curator of Fashion and Decorative Arts at the Museum of London. Currently, I'm the lead curator for the ground floor of our new museum, which will open in 2026. But that is for another talk. In April 2020, I was asked to lead what turned into a major contemporary collecting project relating to the COVID-19 pandemic. This will be the focus of my presentation. But I will start with a short look at the history of contemporary collecting at the Museum of London. Contemporary collecting is sometimes presented as a new phenomenon. In 2014, London's Victoria and Albert Museum received much publicity when it launched their Rapid Response Gallery. In an article for Design Week, this was called, quote, an entirely new way of collecting and curating. What might have been new for the V&A, a family of art, design and performance museums, namely the fact that objects had been chosen, quote, not because of their inherent design value or their beauty, but because they have hit the headlines or made a significant social or political impact in some way, had been common practice in social history museums for some time. The foundations for contemporary collecting were laid by the emerging interest in popular mass culture after the Second World War, which is also reflected in the increased use of oral history from the 1970s onwards. Collecting the present usually seems to go hand in hand with a desire to broaden the scope of a collection. As Edith Mayo noted in her Prescient article published in 1981, quote, the greater the use made of mass media and mass production, the greater the mass culture, and the greater the possibility that objects of the upper classes will be increasingly unrepresentative of the society as a whole. Preservation of such mass culture will probably result in less of an elite collection than exists today in most museums. Gathering and displaying less of an elite collection was one aim of what was then the London Museum when it opened in April 1912. Its founders were eager to acquire objects which other institutions, like the British or Victoria and Albert Museum, might reject. The new museum was to appeal to the everyday Londoner and to touch the daily life of its visitors. The museum was closed for 2 years during the First World War, but its first keeper, Guy Lakin, kept himself and his staff busy. Objects documenting the effects of the war were collected while it was raging, particularly works of art and workwear worn by women who had taken on the roles of men. During the Second World War, clothes were rationed in Britain and again became a collecting focus. There was no organized contemporary collecting between the wars, but objects were occasionally acquired in the same year they were made or used, such as a wedding dress worn in 1934 by the daughter-in-law of one of the museum's founders. Echoing developments elsewhere, the London Museum increasingly collected present-day objects from the 1960s onwards. I particularly like this example, a dress to dance the twist in, which the assistant keeper believed was, quote, the thought of thing we ought to have, simply because I suspect the fashion will not last, and should therefore be caught on the wing as it flies. Like these pop socks depicting sharks, contemporary objects were often added to the collection by museum staff. In 1976, the London Museum was amalgamated with another collection to form the Museum of London and moved to a new building in the city. Currently, the museum's mission is to represent London and all its people, And we also have the somewhat tough challenge to be a force for good. I will now give a few examples of more recent contemporary collecting projects. In October 2011, Occupy London set up camp at St. Paul's Cathedral, 5 minutes walk away from the museum. Quickly, a small team was formed which obtained banners, posters and signs, flyers, newspapers, and even a tambourine. The Museum of London is known for its holdings of protest material. One large collection represents the fight for women's votes by the militant suffragette organization, the Women's Social and Political Union. In 2016, we collected most of the contents, around 790 objects, of the peace camp of protester Brian Hall. He had lived in London's Parliament Square from 2001 to 2010. We knew 5 years in advance that London was going to host the Olympic Games in 2012, but the collecting activities of the curatorial department were not well coordinated, and we probably over-collected, always a risk with contemporary collecting. Nevertheless, we managed to acquire good objects, such as the ever-popular swimming trunks of Tom Daley. A few months prior to the Olympics, the museum had appointed its first digital curator, Hilary Young, who worked with Westminster University to collect Londoners' experiences of the Games using Twitter. 20 participants were asked to tweet at least 10 times a day using the hashtag #CitizenCurators, which resulted in around 700 tweets. What we collected was a spreadsheet, which automatically archived information such as the username, the date, and the text of the tweet. Muslims, who make up more than 1/10 of London's population, are underrepresented in the museum's collection. In 2015, we instigated a small project managed by community collaboration assistant Halima Kanom. At that point, the museum had a senior curator of contemporary history who provided a budget. Halima worked with a small group of Muslim Londoners from a diverse range of backgrounds between the ages of 16 and 30. They took part in workshops, a panel discussion to determine what is Islamic fashion, and field research in Whitechapel, an area of London where in 2011 more than 40% of residents identified as Muslim. The group recommended the acquisition of 6 outfits, which we purchased from their owners, whose oral histories were also recorded. We also produced a booklet to promote the project. The aim and geographic location of Weaving London Stories, started in 2019, was similar. My former colleague Aisling Serand wanted to capture the experiences of British Bangladeshi women and children living in Tower Hamlets. More than 30% of people of Bangladeshi origin make up the largest population group of the borough or district, compared to less than 4% in the rest of the capital. The museum worked in partnership with a youth and community organization based in Tower Hamlets. Following a series of activities, we collected 23 items of clothing and jewelry, photographs, and oral histories. Weaving London Stories was undertaken by the museum's Creating London team, led by Domenico Sergi. During this 4-year program, funded by Arts Council England, the team collected around themes such as Brexit, food, and sport, and put on displays on youth culture in West London, as well as the music genres dub and grime. You will have noticed common threads running through the projects I have presented so far. A desire to make the museum's collection more representative of the diversity of London's population, a combination of physical and digital collecting, with an emphasis on recording Londoners' experiences in their own voice, and working in partnership with external organizations. We profited from our experiences with these smaller campaigns when we embarked on collecting COVID, which I will now turn to. I will focus on aspects of this project that can be applied more broadly, rather than on practical challenges arising from working conditions during a pandemic. The museum closed its doors on Friday, the 19th of March 2020, and did not reopen until the 6th of August 2020. The curatorial team, now working from home, first met to talk about collecting the pandemic on 25th of March 2020, and the project began officially a few weeks later. We might have felt an increased sense of urgency because only in March 2019, we had closed a display about disease X, the term introduced the previous year by the World Health Organization to, quote, represent the knowledge that a serious international epidemic could be caused by a pathogen currently unknown. Preparing disease X, we realized that we were short of objects documenting earlier pandemics. This lack influenced our main aim, to acquire enough objects so that in the future we could represent the different experiences of life in the capital during the pandemic. In her 1981 article mentioned earlier, Edith Mayo stated her belief that, quote, the museum profession must see the gradual emergence of a new breed of curator and a change in emphasis from collecting of the past to a connoisseurship of the present and the future, a connoisseurship of anticipation. So that's what we were trying to do, or to be. Other goals and principles soon emerged. We were keen to include types of objects we had not collected before. We focused on objects that already existed, rather than asking Londoners to produce something just for us, such as writing a diary. We preferred objects that linked to what the museum already owns, and we wanted to devise and test a methodology for rapid collecting. The collecting brief was drawn up by the head of the curatorial department, Lynn Davis, and was approved by our collections committee on the 7th of April 2020. We were asked to collect around 5 main themes. The effect on London's physical environment, but also the increased time spent online. The experience of key and essential workers, as well as working from home, and the effect on young people and children. We envisaged 3 phases: rapid and time-sensitive collecting, processing acquisitions, starting to fill in gaps, and passive collecting, and closing more gaps until the end of June 2021. And we more or less stuck to this timetable. And we split the project into 3 ways of collecting, each overseen by one curator: museum-initiated, community engagement and partnerships, and public call-out. The entire project was, of course, not just undertaken by us 3, but also involved a project manager, an assistant curator, most of the rest of the curatorial department at times, as well as colleagues from conservation, communication, and other museum departments. We were granted a budget of £10,000 and could spend up to £500 without asking for permission. Expenditure over £500 had to be sanctioned by the head of department and over £1,000 by the director of content. It was understood that the risk of over-collecting was high, but this was accepted by the museum. We began by filling in a spreadsheet with our ideas, which were prompted by our own experiences and what was in the news. But a museum is not a newspaper, and we often found it difficult to identify a physical object that could illustrate a particular theme. For instance, in the early days, like many people, I was preoccupied with obtaining food, but how do you collect around that? I became obsessed with the idea of absence of things such as toilet paper, but also the absence of sound, of people, of touch. How do you represent what Owen Riss calls, quote, intangible material, experiences, feelings, opinions in a social history museum? I also did not just want to collect the obvious, such as hand sanitizers and masks, some of which, of course, we did acquire. Many times we asked ourselves, what is the object? Recording an oral history was one often suggested solution to represent an experience, but I was keen to collect as many physical objects as possible. Maybe I'm idealistic, but I agree with Sidney Dillon Ripley, long-term secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, who wrote in 1970, quote, museums provide immediate encounters with authenticity, or a reasonable simulacrum of it. They provide questions and not all the answers, they exhibit truth in the form of objects. In this brave new world of ours, perhaps only objects which inherently possess truth can teach truth. An object to be touched, seen, felt, smelled is true. I realize there's quite a bit here to question. Simulacrum and authenticity seem to be antonyms, and museums rarely allow their objects to be touched. But this is for another time. We called an object or an acquisition museum-initiated when it was instigated by us. This trend was overseen by digital curator Fotini Ahavani, who came up with the most exciting and innovative projects. We had to act quickly to record phenomena such as London's quiet streets and asked the cycle courier to film his journeys through the empty city, London's usually bustling business district. The museum holds sound recordings taken in 1928, when it was feared London was becoming too loud. Fotini commissioned a sound artist to take new recordings in the same locations, accompanied by a street inspector with a camera. During the first lockdown, posters made by designers and artists appeared around the capital. We collected examples of this unofficial street art, some of which related closely to historic posters we already own. Unlike the Cooper Hewitt Museum, who I believe only collected posters digitally, we often took both, a physical poster and a digital file, which we can print out ourselves in the future. We were keen to document the use of social media, which became even more important during this period of isolation. Fotini acquired 14 viral tweets, defined by her as tweets shared or liked by at least 30,000 people. She obtained permission from Twitter to collect an image of the tweet, and if videos were involved, they were acquired in WebM format. One of the main challenges was obtaining copyright from the people who had published the tweets. The museum's copyright form is complicated. We still require a signed paper copy. Not every person reacted to direct messages, and if they did, they often did not understand why they should sign a form. Another project that gained much publicity was Fotini's collaboration with the Canadian Museum of Dreams to record 20 Londoners recounting their pandemic dreams or nightmares, several of which featured anxieties around masks.
And, are that, like when the dream that you described, when you kind of, you realise that no one's wearing a mask and you're not wearing a mask, does that then sort of, does it then become a kind of heightened anxiety type thing?
Yeah, yes, that's right. Yeah, it's like I then become anxious that there's no masks.
Yeah, that's interesting, very interesting.
I mentioned that we concentrated on ready-mades, but there are many exceptions. We engaged with 5 families who documented the first Ramadan in lockdown. As you will know, Ramadan is the 9th month of the Islamic calendar, observed by Muslims with fasting from dawn to sunset, prayer and reflection. Reacting to prompts, the families recorded their experience in different ways, through photographs, videos, voice notes, and in writing, and we also asked for objects. Each family received a small payment for their contribution. We asked 5 young women to reflect on their Ramadan via WhatsApp and collected their conversation and associated media files. When protests erupted following the death of George Floyd, it was decided that they should become part of this project. Fotini provided advice on digital collecting to London's Black Cultural Archives, and they agreed in turn to transfer any physical objects they were not acquiring. Having previously worked with Arsenal Football Club, Fotini obtained a shirt worn by the then captain Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang with the BLM logo on the sleeve. We made these acquisitions in consultation with one of our museum staff networks, which is made up of and represents colleagues of color. They advised that we should not just collect around the hardships of people of color who were disproportionately affected by the pandemic, but also celebrate their contributions. One example of this are recordings of key workers we acquired from the Empathy Museum. We had supported the organization's application for funding and were given their London-related oral histories and accompanying photographic portraits. We usually work with partners when undertaking contemporary collecting, particularly when it is in areas where we do not have expertise or contacts, and also to share resources. I was in charge of a third method of collecting, a call out to the public to email us suggestions for objects. We were one of the first museums in the UK to announce COVID collecting, and the call out was widely publicised on TV and radio when we launched on the 23rd of April 2020. 1 week later, we had received more than 200 suggestions. By the end of August 2020, almost 500 people had emailed. Everyone received a personal reply written by Assistant Curator Natasha Fenner or me. The call-out happened only 1 month into the pandemic, which made it difficult to anticipate what we might want. My connoisseurship of the present and the future was not great, and I was not specific enough, which caused problems. Thinking it was obvious that we would only collect items relating to London, I did not emphasize this fact, for instance, and we received many suggestions from other cities. We should also have foreseen that many people would email photos, but our time-consuming collecting procedure made it impossible to collect individual or very small groups of images. Instead, we referred people to the Museum of the Home, which had set up an easy way to submit images online. Jilke Golbach, our photography curator then, acquired images, but she concentrated on series from established photographers. Additionally, we could have followed the approach of the Museum of the City of New York, which asked for images via their Instagram channel. I also really like the hybrid approach of MUSEM, the Museum of European and Mediterranean Civilizations in Marseille, in France, which launched their Life Under Lockdown project in June 2020. Donors were asked to send in one or more photos of a meaningful object together with a spoken or written testimonial. Over 600 images were received, all were collected, and then in the second phase, around 170 people were asked to donate the object, resulting in 120 or so acquisitions. Collecting COVID involved curators covering different sections of our collection. We used an online spreadsheet to gather comments from everyone. We do like our spreadsheets. We do not often discuss acquisitions with each other, and it was interesting to see how some objects incited different opinions. There were many discussions about the importance of the Londonness of objects. At that point, we had no intention to exhibit our pandemic objects in the near future, which donors often found very difficult to understand. Why would you collect if not for a display? When making selections, however, I found it helpful to imagine the entire collection as an exhibition. We made around 170 individual acquisitions overall, which equates to about 680 individual objects. Around 50 acquisitions resulted from the call-out. Here's a small sample of what we collected. Many people suggested objects made to support the work of the National Health Service, or NHS. In the UK and other countries, residents went outside on Thursday evenings, clapping or making noise to express their appreciation for healthcare workers. An artist in West London produced signs for her windows, which corresponded to a placard in our collection made by so-called human billboard Stanley Green, also known as Protein Man. We acquired diaries in various forms, traditional handwritten journals, blog posts, and this Instagram story. Many people turn to writing poetry. Poems are not normally something we collect, but we made an exception for this project. The public call-out also delivered many of the objects relating to the experience of children and young people, one of our major collecting strands. This included 4 short films recorded on a phone by a teacher of the deaf, which shows students using sign language to talk about their experiences. In the first months of 2020, we started to work on projects relating to themes we had found difficult to represent so far, such as loneliness and bereavement. We contacted several London care homes for older people. The art therapist of one home had invited residents to shoot images of the virus with a paint gun. We acquired one gun, one of the paintings, and accompanying images. We commissioned social art studio ALAS, Applied Life Art Studio, to create a project about mental health. ALAS worked with partnership organizations to find participants who attended online and offline workshops. They expressed their struggles through drawings made on scraper boards. The drawings were combined into a wallpaper, which we collected as a digital file, together with the boards, photos, written notices, and voice notes. And lastly, for telling stories, my colleague Natasha Vickers partnered with a hospice, a place which offers end-of-life care. In workshops, 10 people who had lost a loved one shared their experiences, which were visualized by illustrator Olivia Twist in 6 prints. I could go on, but I will now end with a few reflections. I think we achieved our aim to acquire objects reflecting many different experiences during the pandemic. In March 2021, we conducted a survey to establish the ethnic background of donors, and we were pleased that it was somewhat more diverse than our regular profile. We could have done more to publicize our project in media that serve particular communities. As already mentioned, we should have been more specific in our call out about what we wanted, but that was difficult at the time. Dealing with so many people not familiar with museum procedures showed that our processes can appear complicated and confusing. This prompted us to write a short document explaining what happens during an acquisition. It does not look as fun as this Cooper Hewitt example, they had the same idea. We are also still working on making a copyright form easier to understand. The project was challenging, not only for practical reasons, but also because it was difficult to collect around a theme that we were all living through. On the plus side, our small core team of 3 people was given a lot of agency, which enabled us to react and make decisions quickly. We were all aware of the importance of what we were doing. It helped that the people we were in touch with were very encouraging, and we received positive feedback. I want to end with a thank you message that we emailed to donors in October 2020. And this is not normally something we do. And I would like to thank you again for the invitation and for listening. If you have any questions or comments, please do get in touch. You can see my email on the screen. Thanks again and goodbye.